Back in March of this year, the president of Finland, Stubb, gave a speech in New Delhi. And this speech, really struck me as thoughtful, measured, and reflective of something deeper that we all have been sensing and are continuing and struggling to articulate clearly. Namely that the world order we've lived inside for the past several decades is changing, and obviously, and that's putting it mildly, changing. In the speech that he gave, Stubb begins with a very simple but insightful observation. He says that human beings tend to make three mistakes when thinking about world politics. We over-rationalise the past, we over-dramatise the present, and by doing these two things, we end up underestimating the future. Now, I don't think it's hard to see what he means by that. When we look backwards, we do tend to tell ourselves neat wee stories about how things worked out. We say the Cold War had its logic, the post-war order had its structure, the West led, institutions governed, and the rules were broadly understood. Now, whether or not those stories were ever fully true, they did give us a sense that the world once had a coherent shape. Then when we look at the present and everything feels chaotic, wars in Ukraine, the Middle East, Sudan, which is rarely mentioned, and tensions then between major powers, economic fragmentation, technology accelerating faster than politics seems able to manage. And from inside this moment, let's say, it can feel as though the world has suddenly fallen apart. And Stubb in this speech is cautioning against both temptations. Yes, the world is changing, but it has always been changing. And if we are serious about understanding this moment we're living through, nostalgia and panic are equally unhelpful, is where the centre of this talk he's given. And so where his speech becomes particularly interesting is when he turns to what he sees as the central geopolitical shift now underway. His argument is straightforward. He's saying the era of a Western-dominated world is over. And I don't feel that he says that in a way that is a slogan or a criticism, and not in the way he presents it. It's simply a description of the structural reality emerging in the international system. Like economic growth, demographic weight, and political agency are increasingly concentrated outside the traditional Western core. The global south is no longer a passive space in the world politics. It's becoming one of the principal areas where the future of the international order will be shaped. And in that emerging landscape, Stubb places particular emphasis on India. India, Stubb suggests, represents something that the West is only now beginning to learn again. And that's the importance of strategic autonomy. For decades, India has practiced what is often described as non-alignment, or more recently, multi-alignment. It has maintained partnerships in multiple directions without allowing itself to become fully dependent on any single bloc. And from Stubb's perspective, this approach reflects a certain realism about how the world actually works. States must defend their interests, they must maintain flexibility, and they must operate in a system where values matter, but power and geography also shape the possibilities available. To capture this balance, Stubb uses a phrase that I found quite interesting, and that is values-based realism. The idea is simple but very, very subtle. It means holding on to certain principles like democracy, rights, rule of law, while at the same time acknowledging that the world is made up of very different political systems, cultures, and historical trajectories. Engagement cannot be restricted only to those who already share the same worldview. Cooperation must occur even where values differ. In other words, idealism alone can't guide foreign policy, but neither can pure cynicism. And so, from where I am sitting, this is one of the more thoughtful attempts currently being made within Western political circles to think through the transition that is underway. Stubb doesn't pretend that the liberal order built after World War II remains intact in the same way it once was. At the same time, he doesn't argue that the answer is simply to abandon institutions and accept a world governed entirely by raw power. Instead, he proposes reform. International institutions, he argues, need to become more representative. The United Nations Security Council should expand, he says. The voices of Asia, Africa, and Latin America should carry greater weight. Economic institutions created in the mid-20th century need to reflect the economic realities of the 21st. If the global order is to retain legitimacy, it must begin to look like the world that actually exists today. And I think that there is a great deal in this argument that's sensible. And yet, for me, I find myself feeling that there's something deeper that sits underneath the problem that he's describing. Like Stubb frames the moment as a transition between two possible futures. That's how it seems to me, anyway. On the one side lies what he calls conflictual multipolarity, a world dominated by transactions, spheres of influence and raw power politics. On the other side lies the possibility of a renewed and more representative multilateral system where institutions and rules continue to shape global behaviour. But what if the real difficulty isn't simply choosing between those two models? What if the deeper challenge here is that the systems shaping our world have become so complex that no political framework, whether Western, multipolar or institutional, can easily grasp them? And this thought has been coming up repeatedly in my own reflections here on this channel, and think about it. Look around and consider the layers of interaction now shaping global events. Financial markets respond instantly to geopolitical shocks. Energy systems, for example, link distant conflicts to domestic price changes. Social media networks amplify narratives across borders in real time. Artificial intelligence is beginning to influence everything from military planning to economic productivity. Climate systems interact with migration patterns, food security, and political stability. All of these dynamics are operating simultaneously. And yet the institutions and mental models we inherited for governing the world were largely designed in a very different era. One where systems were slower, simpler, and easier to interpret. And seen from this angle, the crisis we're witnessing may not simply be a crisis of power or legitimacy. It may also be a crisis of understanding. Our political structures are attempting to steer systems whose complexity exceeds the cognitive frameworks available to them. Now, this doesn't mean Stubb's proposals are wrong. Reforming institutions and expanding representation are clearly necessary steps. A world order, that excludes most of the planet cannot remain stable indefinitely, But institutional reform alone may not be sufficient, I feel. For me, the deeper question becomes, how do human beings and the political systems we build learn to think clearly inside systems of this scale and complexity? And for me, that's a very different kind of challenge altogether. It's not only a matter of diplomacy or institutional design, it's also a matter of cognition, quite frankly, of sense-making, of developing new ways of understanding the interactions between technology, economics, ecology, and politics that now shape our collective future. So, this is why I found Stubb's speech both encouraging and incomplete at the same time. Encouraging because it shows that thoughtful voices within the Western political world are beginning to acknowledge that the old assumptions no longer hold. Incomplete because even these more adaptive perspectives still seem to underestimate how profoundly the nature of the system itself has changed. The tradition we're living through is not just geopolitical. It is also intellectual and cognitive. We are being asked to rethink how the world works at the same time as the world itself is changing. Now, no one has a finished answer to that, but conversations like the one Stubb is trying to start are part of the process. They help to move the discussion away from nostalgia and toward a more honest engagement with the realities of the emerging world. If there's one lesson I took from listening to his speech, it's this. The future of the international order will not be decided solely by which countries hold the most power. You can be sure of it. It will also depend on whether we can develop the intellectual tools necessary to understand the systems we have created. And in that sense, the challenge before us is not only political, it's cognitive. Icarus landing. Trying to stay landed in the body, lads. Just for today.